Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into brocade gowns and embroidered slippers to explore something you probably didn't learn in history class, the disturbing legacy of inbreeding among Europe's royal daughters. Picture yourself in a vast, cold stone castle. Outside, the wind howls over a moat that's more decorative than defensive. Inside, you're wrapped in ermine, staring into a mirror carved from Venetian glass. But it's not your reflection that haunts you, it's your bloodline. Because here's the thing, you're not just royal, you're purely royal. Your family tree looks more like a wreath. And that's not a compliment. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is over there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're born into a world where status means everything, and that status must be preserved at all costs by blood. Not metaphorical blood, literal blood. The logic is airtight in a terrifying way. If your family is the most powerful in Europe, then the only people worthy of marrying into it are yourselves, over and over. Your royalty, and royalty must remain untainted, even if that means wedding your cousin or your uncle, or your double first cousin, which is somehow even worse than it sounds. This is the logic that shaped centuries of royal marriages. Dynasties from the Habsburgs of Austria and Spain to the Bourbons of France and the Plantagenets of England all operated under one great unspoken law: don't dilute the bloodline. Historians still argue whether this was more about politics than superstition, but either way, the result was the same. You might imagine inbreeding as something happening in the shadows, tucked away in backwoods villages. But here it's paraded through golden halls, written into contracts, and celebrated with fireworks and feasts. Royal daughters were both pawns and prizes. Their marriages were decided before they could even pronounce the name of their betrothed. "She's got great cheekbones" meant something very different when your great-uncle was also your father-in-law. The Habsburgs were the reigning champions of this dubious practice. By the time Charles II of Spain was born in 1661, his family had been intermarrying for more than 200 years. Charles had only 32 great-great-great-grandparents instead of the usual 64. That's not a gene pool, that's a gene puddle. And while Charles gets most of the attention, understandably given his tragic condition, it's the daughters who often suffered in quieter, crueler ways. They were expected to be beautiful, obedient, fertile, and strong. They were rarely allowed to be human. If they were sickly, it was whispered away. If they died young, another cousin was shipped in to take their place. Meanwhile, family portraits lined the halls, each one a bit more uncanny than the last, like looking at generations of siblings frozen in time, all with the same elongated face and downturned mouth. You probably won't survive this, not just because of the expectations or the loneliness, but because of what's lurking in your DNA. Conditions like hemophilia, epilepsy, and facial deformities weren't just accidents. They were genetic inevitabilities passed down like crowns. One doctor later described the Habsburg dynasty as an experiment in human biology conducted without consent. But nobody's putting that on the family crest. Take a moment to breathe in the cold, rose-scented air of your royal chambers. Behind you, a lady-in-waiting tightens your corset. Outside, courtiers are whispering about your upcoming marriage. You're 12. Your future husband is your mother's nephew. You smile because you're trained to, but part of you already feels like something's wrong. Deep down, you know the truth. Your blood is blue, but it's also broken. Meanwhile, your tutors are teaching you etiquette embroidery and enough Latin to compose thank you notes to the Pope. No one is teaching you biology. No one is telling you why your older sister had seizures, or why your cousin died in childbirth at 15, or why your family won't let you marry the charming Hungarian stable boy who gives you violets behind the orchard wall. Because love, that's for peasants. You're here to marry for lineage. One fringe theory whispered among later eugenicists, and still debated today, is that centuries of intermarriage among Europe's royals created a kind of inherited melancholy, a tendency towards sadness, passivity, and emotional collapse. It's not provable, but it lingers like incense in an old cathedral. Royal women who should have ruled the world ended up cloistered in convents, crushed by depression or dismissed as hysterical. So tonight, as you settle into bed under an embroidered canopy, think about the cost of perfection. Think about the girls who had no choice but to carry the weight of an entire continent's desire for bloodline purity. You're one of them now, a daughter of Europe, a link in a golden chain that grows more fragile with every generation. You're 13, and you've just been informed you'll marry your uncle. Not like an uncle, your actual, literal mother's brother. His portrait sits on your writing desk, double chin, uneven eyes, and a velvet doublet too tight across his chest. You swallow hard. Not from nerves, from nausea. Welcome to the Habsburg family plan. This isn't an exaggeration. The Spanish Habsburgs, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries, turned inbreeding into a generational strategy. Why marry out when you could double down? It wasn't just one cousin here or there. It was uncle-niece marriages, double first cousins, and tangled loops that make your head spin like a Baroque chandelier. One Habsburg king even had grandparents who were siblings. If you're confused, imagine being born into that family. You're not alone. Many royal daughters faced the same fate, arranged engagements with uncles, nephews, or cousins so close you shared nearly half your genome. On paper, it was about dynastic strength and international alliances. In practice, it was a slow genetic collapse. Imagine you're Infanta Maria Ana of Spain. You've grown up inside the Escorial Palace, surrounded by incense silk and whispered rumors. At age 14, your family ships you off to marry her uncle Ferdinand III of Austria. This isn't even scandalous. It's expected. The Habsburgs had a habit of marrying nieces to uncles or first cousins to first cousins, often for generations in a row. One chart of Habsburg lineage looks less like a tree and more like a spider web that someone punched in the middle. And who's at the center of that punch? Usually a girl born into velvet and gold and bound by duty to marry a man twice her age bearing the same family crest she already wore. And the consequences weren't just theoretical. These marriages produced royal daughters with strikingly similar problems: short stature, chronic illness, cognitive delays, and terrifyingly high infant mortality. There's a reason so many royal daughters are missing from the records. They were born baptized and buried before they could be painted. Historians still argue whether the obsession with bloodline purity was driven by religious dogma or sheer political paranoia. Either way, the result was the same royal daughters became instruments of dynastic continuity. Their lives weren't their own. Their bodies were contracts. Now don't get this twisted, some of these girls pushed back. Maria Theresa of Austria, a later Habsburg empress, tried to diversify the family gene pool after losing several children early. But even she struggled to shake the centuries-long momentum of cousin-to-cousin marriages. After all, marrying outside the royal bubble risked introducing non-Habsburg influence, and we can't have that, can we? There's an eerie uniformity in Habsburg family portraits. The women all have a particular look: narrow shoulders, heavy jaws, large eyes set just a little too close together. You wouldn't notice it if you saw one painting. But walk down a hallway lined with them, and it starts to feel like you're seeing the same girl copied, adjusted, and recopied again. And here's a quirky tidbit you'll appreciate. The Habsburgs' court artists were so good at flattering these women that some future historians were shocked to discover how severe the deformities were when they examined burial remains centuries later. In short, the brush lied. The bones didn't. By now you might be wondering, how did no one put a stop to this? Well, they tried. A few outside observers raised eyebrows. The papacy occasionally murmured about degrees of consanguinity. But the church was easily persuaded, especially with the right political favors. And besides, the Habsburgs were the Holy Roman Emperors. For much of this time, kind of hard to argue when you also control who wears the biggest crown in Christendom. You sit at your window, fingers playing with the edge of your velvet sleeve. Below, courtiers bow to one another, rustling like silk ghosts. A letter arrives announcing your wedding date. The wax seal bears your future husband's initials, and they're also your father's initials because they're brothers. You don't cry. You weren't taught to. Instead, you rehearse your duties. Stand beside your husband-uncle at court. Smile with poise. Produce heirs if you're lucky enough to survive childbirth. And try not to let the seizures or the scoliosis or the bone fragility slow you down. This isn't just your story. It's the story of countless girls born to the royal courts of Europe, prized for their pedigree and discarded when their genetics cracked under pressure. And it wasn't just Spain. The Austrian Habsburgs followed suit, believing that concentrating power within a tight circle would prevent foreign dynasties from creeping in. Instead, they created a slow-motion implosion. Charles II of Spain, the final direct heir of that bloodline, was so sickly and cognitively impaired that royal doctors recorded him as unable to chew food or speak properly. But rewind a generation, and his sisters weren't much better off. Many were married off early, suffered miscarriages, or were quietly removed from public life when their conditions became undeniable. Still, the weddings went on. The painted smiles stayed. The dynasties endured, just long enough to set their daughters up for quiet ruin. You close the letter. You press your palms together. You whisper the prayer they taught you, "May God bless this union." But in your bones, you already feel the curse. You're 15 now, and it's your wedding day. The chapel glows with candlelight, the scent of lilies thick in the air. Dozens of stiff-backed guests bow as you glide past them, veil trailing silk, whispering over marble. You've never met the man you're about to marry. You have, however, seen his jaw. It's your family's calling card, the infamous Habsburg Jaw, and it's the first thing people will notice about your future children. That jaw isn't just a punchline in history books. It's called mandibular prognathism, and in your family it's a feature passed down like royal titles. Elongated lower jaws, thick lips, prominent noses, the result of generation after generation of cousin marriages. You try not to think about it as you say your vows, but it's hard not to when the portraits on the walls look more like mirrors than ancestors. Charles II of Spain may be history's most infamous case, but the jaw shows up in dozens of royal daughters, too subtly at first, then with increasing severity. You try to eat daintily at court banquets, but chewing is painful. Your teeth don't meet properly. You lisp when you speak. Your tutors say, speak slower, when what they mean is speak less. And don't even get started on portrait sittings, hours of being posed to hide your profile angled, just so that your chin doesn't appear to eclipse the goblet in your hand. Historians still argue whether the jaw itself caused physical pain or was simply a visible marker of deeper systemic problems. But one thing is clear, the more generations the Habsburgs kept it in the family, the worse things got. In the 20th century, a geneticist traced the mandibular deformity across 15 generations of royal portraits and skulls, the data grimly consistent. As inbreeding increased, so did the severity of the jaw, and a host of correlated health issues. And it wasn't just the face. That jaw was a red flag waving over an entire genome in distress. Beneath the powdered wigs and velvet gowns, many royal daughters suffered from brittle bones, frequent miscarriages, and neurological disorders. You might look regal from the balcony, but walking downstairs without help, a gamble. Here's a fringe fact for you: in some court circles, the jaw was romanticized. That's right. It was a sign of noble blood. Mothers whispered with pride when their daughters showed signs of the trait. It meant the line was pure. What it really meant was that no one outside the family had been let in for far too long. And let's not pretend you're the only one noticing. Ambassadors from other countries routinely wrote about the royal women of Spain and Austria comments like melancholy disposition, weak of constitution, or visage unfortunate. Translation: beautiful gowns, unfortunate genes. You sit at a feast beside your new husband. He's chewing slowly. You chew slower. A bard strums a lute. Roasted peacock steams on golden platters. Courtiers laugh, but you're not hearing the jokes. You're watching your mother-in-law, who is also your aunt. She hasn't smiled in hours. As you age, if you're lucky enough to, your jaw becomes more pronounced. Your profile is unmistakable, and in time your daughters inherit the same features. One day you sit beside your youngest, dabbing a cloth to her forehead during a fever, and wonder, is this what royal blood buys us? And here's the darker part. Even as the deformities worsened, the Habsburgs refused to change course. The belief in dynastic purity was stronger than medical evidence. The portraits told one story, the funerals told another. And speaking of portraits, have you noticed how eerily flat they seem? That wasn't just the artistic style of the day. Many of those painters were directed to downplay deformities. A crooked jaw could be softened with lighting. A frail arm draped in silk. A sunken chest hidden behind a ruffled bodice. It was a visual cover-up that lasted for centuries. Sometimes you try to catch your reflection in a silver dish or a still basin. You tilt your chin. You touch the hinge of your jaw and wince. There's no surgery for this, no braces, only silence, only the weight of inheritance. At night, you lie beneath a frescoed ceiling, painted with angels who seem to peer down with pity. You wonder if they can see the truth. That for all the wealth and splendor you are more prisoner than princess. That your name, your precious polished name, is etched in the margins of history books, not for what you did, but for what your genes carried. Still, you rise each day. You perform your duties. You attend masses, embroidery circles, and formal court dinners. You smile without showing too much teeth. You walk slowly and pray you don't faint in public, because you are a royal daughter, and your job is to endure. So the next time someone tells you being a princess is every girl's dream, gently remind them only if your jaw can take it. You're Juana of Castile now, but they don't call you Juana. They call you La Loca, the mad. It sounds like a cruel nickname whispered behind fans, but no, it's official. It's history. You're the daughter of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, and someday you're supposed to rule all of Spain. Instead, you end up locked in a convent, pacing for decades, clutching your husband's corpse like a twisted love story written by bad genetics. Let's rewind. You were born into one of the most powerful families in Europe. The Catholic monarchs they called your parents. They united Spain, expelled the Moors, and funded a guy named Columbus. Maybe you've heard of him. You're their third child, smart and pious with a talent for music and languages. But you're also a Habsburg now, thanks to your arranged marriage to Philip the Handsome, a Burgundian prince with charm, ambition, and a deeply unfortunate family tree. And it's that marriage that breaks you. At first it's love. Real, wild, obsessive love. You adore him. He adores other women. You spiral. You confront his mistresses, then forgive him, then repeat. But this isn't a teen drama, it's a dynastic disaster. You have 6 children in rapid succession, each one carrying the same tightly coiled Habsburg DNA. One of them will become Emperor Charles V, another Queen of Hungary. All brilliant, all brittle. But you begin to unravel. You weep uncontrollably. You stop eating. You talk to ghosts. You faint at court, scream at walls, accuse your servants of treachery. After Philip's sudden death, possibly from typhoid, possibly from poison, depending on which historian you ask, you crack wide open. You insist on keeping his body. You refuse to bury it. You carry the coffin across Castile, weeping and praying, certain he'll come back to life. One legend says you opened the coffin to check, kissing the decayed face, whispering lullabies. That's not drama. That's history. Historians still argue whether Juana was truly mentally ill or just the victim of political manipulation. Her father, Ferdinand, had every reason to discredit her. So did her son, Charles. Declaring Juana mad was the most efficient way to sideline her and keep the crown firmly in male hands. Sound familiar? But here's where it gets spookier. What if it wasn't just politics? You share genetics with generations of royals who suffered from epilepsy, depression, and what modern psychologists might now recognize as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. Combine that with intense emotional trauma and the pressures of royalty, and you get a woman who either lost her mind or was made to look like she had. There's a fringe theory that Juana's behavior was triggered not just by grief, but by postpartum complications and possible porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that causes hallucinations and mental confusion. Sound familiar? It's been suggested in royal families from England to Russia, but no one's digging her up to find out. As you age, you fade from public life. You're locked away for protection. Visitors describe you as listless, sunken-eyed, whispering prayers into your sleeves. Other times you're reportedly lucid, even sharp. You write letters. You ask for news. You read religious texts. You beg to see your children. They don't come. You live in isolation for 46 years. That's not a typo. 4, 6 decades. Some nights the nuns hear you singing. Some nights screaming. Either way, you're forgotten. A princess whose name was erased by a single word, Loca. And yet, look at what came from you. Your children. Your grandchildren. generations of monarchs who would go on to shape Europe. But look closer, and you'll see the cracks. The Habsburg jaw, the fevers, the madness. Your legacy is beautiful and broken just like you. You lie on a hard cot, rosary clutched in your fingers, the wind howling through the convent shutters. You remember your husband's smile. You remember the scent of lilies at your wedding. You remember love, betrayal, pain. You remember a time when people bowed when you entered a room. Now the only ones who bow are the nuns, and they don't meet your eyes. Juana la Loca, they call you. But you were more than that. You were a daughter, a queen, a mother, a wife. A girl born into a tangle of crowns and chromosomes she never asked for. A symbol of what happens when politics, grief, and genetics collide. And when they finally carry you to the grave, the bells toll like they would for any queen. Except history won't remember your reign, only your silence. You're 6 years old, and your toys are made of ivory. You have a doll with real human hair, a music box that plays a hymn your mother cries to, and a nursery with hand-painted walls showing lions and angels. The room smells faintly of beeswax and lavender. You don't know it yet, but your childhood is already under threat from within. Royal daughters grow up in silk and splendor, but not all of them grow up at all. In the glittering world of European palaces, childhood was something fragile, precarious like a glass slipper balanced on a staircase. Your governess tells you bedtime stories about your ancestors. She skips the part where most of them died before age 12. You have cousins in France who suffer seizures when the candles flicker too fast. A sister in Vienna with twisted feet who walks only with help. A niece in Madrid who's already been promised to her first cousin, though she can't pronounce his name because of a cleft palate. Childhood wasn't spared by royalty. In fact, it was especially endangered. And girls born to inbred dynasties often bore the brunt of this hidden inheritance. Here's a mainstream fact that stings between the 16th and 18th centuries. Up to 50% of royal children in some Habsburg lines died before reaching adulthood. Half. Think about that. Every second name in the family tree cut short. The portraits that survive just the lucky ones. Take Margaret Teresa of Spain, for example. You know her even if you don't realize it. She's the little girl in the center of Las Meninas, that famous Velázquez painting standing regal in her farthingale and ringlets. She looks like a doll brought to life. But Margaret was no fairy tale. She was betrothed at age 3 to her uncle, married him at 15, gave birth to 4 children, and died before her 22nd birthday. And while her life may have been short, her medical profile was long stunted growth, suspected infertility issues, and severe physical weakness, likely tied to the family's staggering inbreeding coefficient, over 25%. That's the genetic equivalent of being your own cousin. Historians still argue whether these royal childhood ailments were primarily caused by inbreeding or by poor medical care, which, let's be honest, involved more leeches than logic. But genetics played a part too large to ignore. You sit in your nursery trying to play. Your fingers fumble, your legs cramp. A maid whispers behind your back, and your nurse hushes her. They've seen it before. Children who don't grow, who don't speak, who don't make it past their 10th name day. Stillborn sisters, silent brothers. A fringe detail for you: some royal nurseries kept miniature coffins on hand ready to be used. A chilling efficiency painted in gold leaf. And yet, when you're well, you're treated like a miniature goddess. You wear pearls before you lose your baby teeth. You're paraded through ballrooms with powdered cheeks. Ambassadors scribble notes about your graceful demeanor and delicate frame, not realizing that delicate might mean something very different when you collapse from walking too long. Your education focuses on court etiquette, religious devotion, and the fine art of not fainting during Mass. No one teaches you biology. You're not told why your joints ache or why you bruise from brushing against a chair, or why your older cousin bled out after a minor fall, the physicians wringing their hands in helplessness. You practice smiling in the mirror, trying to hide the gap in your teeth, the set of your jaw, the slight tremor in your right hand. You're told to stand still for portraits, even if your hips throb. You're told to be perfect. And that's the word they'll put beneath your likeness, Infanta Archduchess, Princess of the Blood. But the truth, you're just a little girl playing dress-up in a body that's already betraying you. Your brother dies before turning 7. Your cousin is born with a fused spine. Your sister, once the brightest light in the nursery, now sleeps 18 hours a day and won't speak. And still the cycle continues. Because royal blood must marry royal blood. And that means you're already engaged. The ring sits in a box on your mother's vanity. It's gold, it's heavy, and it has your family crest on both sides, his and yours. Because of course it does. At night, when the fire dies down and the castle creaks in its sleep, you lie awake listening to the wind howl across the ramparts. You count the dolls on your shelf, each one dressed like a cousin, each one named after someone who didn't make it. You say their names out loud, one by one. You hope someone someday will say yours. You're 16, and you've just been told you're beautiful. Not by your betrothed, he's busy inspecting cavalry horses, but by your father's physician, who adds a hesitant for now. It's a strange compliment. You've never broken a bone. Your complexion is clear. Your spine, though a bit curved, can still be hidden under the stiff boning of your bodice. So yes, for now you're beautiful. But beauty in your world comes with conditions and an expiration date. You sit for portraits that will be sent to potential husbands across Europe. Your skin is painted porcelain smooth, your waist cinched to impossible proportions. What the canvas doesn't show is your diet of boiled meat and tonic wine to treat fainting fits, or the rib you bruised last week from sneezing too hard, or how your hips ache when you stand too long at court. Because while you may look like a living emblem of royal elegance, your body is quietly buckling under centuries of genetic strain. Hemophilia, scoliosis, osteogenesis imperfecta, the glass bone disease. These aren't words anyone in your family understands yet, but they know the symptoms. Bleeding that won't stop after a fall. A toddler whose legs curve like a shepherd's crook. A teenage princess with a spine shaped like a question mark. Historians still debate whether the frequency of these conditions in royal families was due purely to inbreeding or made worse by the medieval treatments administered mercury baths, purgatives, arsenic tonics. But there's no denying the correlation between consanguineous marriage and physical fragility. It's written not just in documents, but in the very bones of exhumed royal corpses. Here's a quirky twist. Some royal daughters were celebrated because of their pallor. Pale skin, delicate frames, a tendency to swoon. It was seen as the height of femininity. Courtiers wrote about how gracefully you fainted during Easter Mass. Artists painted you as the lily of the court. They didn't know that lily-white color came from anemia, or that your dizzy spells were early signs of vascular weakness. You're paraded at a feast in Vienna wearing a sapphire choker so tight you feel faint. The candles shimmer. The food smells faintly of nutmeg and venison. You smile. Your vision swims. No one notices when you grip the edge of the table to steady yourself. That's good. Dignity matters more than oxygen. And yet everyone wants a daughter like you. You're the perfect ornament until you're not. Your cousin Maria Anna of Austria was praised for her beauty, married off to the Bavarian elector, and dead of tuberculosis by 24. Another Isabella of Austria was praised as the Pearl of Burgundy until childbirth fractured her pelvis, and no one thought to fix it. That's the pattern. Your body is admired until it fails. Then it's quietly buried beneath marble slabs inscribed with long, gilded names. There's one mirror in your bedchamber you refuse to look into. It's too honest. You prefer the hand mirror with its warped silver back. It makes you look softer, less angular. More like the girl you were taught to be, and less like the truth you're living. A fringe theory suggests that scoliosis was more prevalent among royal women, not only because of inbreeding, but also because of the tight corsets worn from childhood. Bones softened by poor nutrition and bad genetics were compressed for aesthetics. The result, a generation of daughters whose beauty literally crushed their bodies. At night, your maid helps you unlace your corset. You exhale trembling. Your spine pops softly as it expands. You lie flat on the bed, eyes tracing the frescoed ceiling, heart pounding against your rib cage like it's trying to escape. You're told to pray, so you do. Not for strength or power, but for another day of seeming whole, of no public falls, no bleeding gums, no broken toe from stepping wrong on a staircase. You don't ask for health. You ask for appearance. Because in this world, that's what survives the portrait. And then comes the marriage. You're packed like an heirloom escorted by guards in gold-threaded trunks. Your new family waits with polite smiles. You know what they're thinking. Can she bear children? Will she last a decade? You smile, because you've practiced for this. Later in private, your new husband will whisper that your hands are cold. You'll murmur that it's always been that way. You don't say why. You don't say that your fingers cramp after writing more than a few lines. That you wear gloves not for style, but because your skin bruises too easily. You'll go to sleep beside a man who shares half your DNA and twice your expectations. And in the darkness, you'll whisper to yourself, I'm still beautiful. Even if you're not sure it matters anymore. You've arrived in France and everything smells like violets and intrigue. Versailles is a palace made of gold and gossip. And you, dear daughter of the Bourbons, are here to sparkle, preferably without seizing in front of the king. The French court doesn't do anything quietly. Powdered wigs tower like birthday cakes. Gowns swish with 100 feet of silk. Conversations float on clouds of perfume and passive aggression. But beneath the glamour, the same old bloodline problem is quietly unspooling. You may have left Vienna or Madrid behind, but the inbreeding that packed its trunk too. France's royal families weren't immune to the allure of keeping it in the family. The Bourbons especially, in the 17th and 18th centuries, liked their royal brides thoroughly vetted and preferably related. Not quite Habsburg-level spirals, but still. You're expected to marry your cousin's second cousin, or someone who shares a surname you already have monogrammed on your linens. And you're expected to look fabulous while doing it. You're introduced to the court as a new duchess or princess or future queen. You curtsy perfectly, smile through hours of ceremonies, and pretend you don't notice your left hand twitching when you're nervous. You've had episodes before. Back home, your maid whispered that your cousin had the same spells, eyes rolling back limbs, jerking the whole court, pretending it was just female nerves. But here in France, they call it la grande faiblesse, the great weakness, a poetic term for what's probably hereditary epilepsy. Historians still argue whether epilepsy was hidden behind euphemisms or genuinely misunderstood in the royal court. But we know this French princesses from several branches of the Bourbon dynasty were known to suffer from fits, melancholic fainting, or spells of divine visitation. Some were sent to convents. Others simply disappeared from the public eye. And here's a weird little tidbit: in Versailles, fainting was kind of in vogue. Court ladies would swoon into chairs during boring sermons, and having a delicate constitution was practically a flex. But when it happened to you violently, unpredictably, it wasn't charming. It was dangerous. You remember your cousin, Marie-Louise, daughter of Louis XV's sister. She was lovely, bright-eyed, and known to pass out in gardens without warning. She died at 18. The official cause was pneumonia. Unofficially, she'd been falling too often. The last fall involved marble steps, a cracked temple, and a hurried burial. You now sleep on a bed of embroidered roses, and each morning you wake with a dull ache in your neck and a rising panic that today might be the day the great weakness reappears. You've stopped eating sweet pastries because sugar seems to bring on the shaking. You avoid bright lights, loud music, and long conversations. And still you're expected to produce heirs. You marry a distant cousin whose face is powdered and polite, whose breath smells faintly of brandy and crushed violets. He seems gentle, which is fortunate because you're not sure you could survive violence. Your bones feel hollow. You bruise from brushing your arm against the bedpost. Your doctors offer tonics, scented satchels, and one very uncomfortable suggestion involving leeches behind your ears. The seizures, when they come, are private. Always private. Your maid has been trained to hide them. She locks the door. She places a rolled towel between your teeth. She counts in Latin to calm herself. You do not scream. You do not tell anyone, because if you do, you'll be labeled. And once you're labeled, your usefulness vanishes. You begin to study your family tree at night. The names, the patterns. You notice how many of your aunts lived quietly in the countryside. How many sisters were too ill to attend court? How many daughters were fragile, melancholic, delicate, or unsuited for marriage? You trace your finger down a gilded page and feel like you're reading your own obituary. And here's a nasty irony: French physicians began noticing a trend. The more royal the pedigree, the weaker the daughter. Some were born with soft skulls, others with undeveloped lungs or joint problems. One girl in the court of Louis XVI reportedly had such fragile bones she couldn't stand without pain. They called her La Porcelaine. She died before her wedding night. And yet Versailles kept spinning. Balls continued. Music played. The court laughed and danced. Portraits were painted with healthy complexions, even if the subject needed to be propped up for the session. You stare at your own reflection in a gilded mirror. You look beautiful, almost immortal, but you know better. You feel your body slowing. You sense a tremor behind your eyes. And you wonder, if you had been born a peasant, just a baker's daughter, would you still be sick? Would you be stronger? Happier, alive longer? It's a forbidden question. So you press it down deep into the folds of your memory. You curtsy, you smile, you dance, and inside you wait for the next fall. You walk down a shadowy corridor, candle flickering in your hand, the cold stone of the Tudor walls pressing in on either side. You're royalty, yes, but not the royalty. You're a cousin, a niece, a sister of a queen. Specifically, you're one of the lesser-known women orbiting around England's most enigmatic monarch, Elizabeth I. She's the Virgin Queen Gloriana head held high, red wig, unshakable. But you're the spare, the background singer, the royal daughter who didn't make it into the history books, at least not as a headline act. And yet your bloodline is just as twisted as hers. By the late 1500s, the Tudors were already swimming in the consequences of cousin marriage and familial paranoia. Royal daughters like you were chess pieces in a game where marriage meant power or disaster. But here's the problem. If Elizabeth doesn't marry, spoiler, she doesn't, then you might just become a dynastic threat. You start noticing how inconvenient women in your family tend to disappear. There's Lady Catherine Grey, Elizabeth's cousin, married in secret to a man of decent but dangerous pedigree. When the Queen found out, house arrest. Catherine's children were declared illegitimate. She spent the rest of her short life locked away in isolation, fading like parchment in a drawer. Then there's her sister, Lady Mary Grey. You might say she got the fun-size end of the gene pool, just 4 feet tall with a hunchback and clubfoot. Courtiers whispered she was a curiosity, and not the charming kind. But even she married without royal permission. Elizabeth had her confined too. Small or not, she was still a Grey, and that made her dangerous. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth feared genuine usurpation or simply couldn't stand anyone else having a romantic storyline. Either way, she kept her royal cousins close and unmarried. You try to stay out of trouble. You dress modestly, bow deeply, and smile blandly. You learn your psalms and play the lute just poorly enough to avoid praise. The trick to survival, you realize, is invisibility. But invisibility comes at a price. You're lonely. Not just no suitors lonely, but deep, bone-hollow echo in the courtyard lonely. You're not allowed to marry beneath your station, and the few nobles you might wed are either dead imprisoned or deemed politically inconvenient. And since your family is obsessed with pure lineage, there's pressure to eventually marry someone within your blood circle again. Another cousin. Another genetic roll of the dice. And your body, it shows the strain. You've had the breath since childhood, a wheezing cough that gets worse in the damp seasons. Your fingers are oddly bent. You faint if you stand too quickly. The court physician blames female weakness and prescribes boiled herbs and leeching. But your wet nurse once told you a story about your great-grandmother who had the same narrow chest and died in childbirth at 16. You start to suspect it's not just bad luck, it's the family. A fringe theory whispered behind fans at court is that the Tudors and their extended kin carried some latent genetic defect. Nothing specific, just an air of fragility that clung to the girls more than the boys. Maybe it's apocryphal, maybe it's superstition, but it's oddly consistent. Royal daughters who suffer from recurring fevers, seizures, bleeding gums, and unshakable melancholy. The court keeps these facts quiet. No one wants to admit that the future of England might be fragile, that even the Virgin Queen herself might have inherited more than red hair from her troubled line. But Elizabeth is smart, brilliant even. She sees it too. That's why she keeps her circle tight, her women monitored, and her cousins unmarried. She knows that one wedding can shift an empire, and one birth could mean civil war. So better to keep you, dear royal daughter, in velvet chains. You spend your days embroidering and your nights dreaming. Sometimes you imagine running away to the countryside, changing your name, marrying a brewer. But then you wake up to the sound of guards passing by your chamber door. and you remember who you are. You're not a queen. You're a warning, and here's your quirky tidbit. In a letter now held at the British Library, a courtier once described the Queen's female relatives as caged linnets, colorful, songful, and forever trapped behind royal bars. The phrase stuck. People even painted portraits of noble women with tiny birds in their hands, a cheeky nod to their gilded prison. You've come to understand the bird metaphor well. You sing when they want you to. You sit pretty, but your wings, you keep them folded. Because if you fly too high, you'll vanish. Just like Catherine, just like Mary, just like all the royal daughters who were a little too visible, a little too spirited, or just unlucky enough to be born with the wrong last name. And so you survive, silent, still, and very, very royal. The castle walls echo with lullabies and sobs. You're a royal daughter, and you're pregnant again. But instead of joy, there's dread. Because in your world, pregnancy is less about miracle and more about Russian roulette. From the moment your belly swells beneath embroidered silk, you become less a woman and more a vessel, an incubator for alliances, a walking, whispering gamble. Everyone around you smiles and says, "A blessing," but you can feel the fear beneath their curtsies. Because royal pregnancies don't end in fairy tales nearly as often as the tapestries suggest. You shuffle across cold stone floors with aching ankles, swollen joints, and a heartbeat that thunders in your ears. You've been bled for balance, fed on boiled pears, forbidden cheese. You sleep sitting up because lying flat might make the baby sink. And here's the thing. They never carve into marble plaques thanks to centuries of inbreeding. Your odds of surviving childbirth are about the same as surviving battle. Maybe worse. Your hips might be too narrow, your blood too weak. Your immune system inherited from a long-dead uncle twice removed and once married to his own niece. Take poor Maria Anna of Austria, for instance. A Habsburg through and through, married to her cousin. Her pregnancies were treated like royal events, yet out of her 6 births, only 3 children survived. And she herself, frail, ghostly, pale, and riddled with complications. Historians still argue whether royal women were over-medicated or undercared for. Some claim that constant interference by male doctors made things worse. Bleedings, purgatives, and crude interventions that would horrify any modern nurse. Others say it was just the consequence of a genetic gene pool no deeper than a bird bath. Meanwhile, you are trying to breathe through the ache in your ribs. Midwives scurry in and out. Candles burn low. Someone murmurs a prayer in Latin you don't understand. You remember your sister's labor. The screaming that lasted 2 nights. The silence that followed. Her child never drew breath. Her body never recovered. She used to braid your hair by the fire. Now there's just a locket and a locked room. And here's the cruelest part, even when the baby lives, it's not always a happy ending. Many royal daughters gave birth to children with the same inherited frailties, seizures, misshapen skulls, or impossibly delicate lungs. Like Charles II of Spain, whose mother Mariana of Austria was also his aunt. Her pregnancy was considered a divine union. Her son sadly became a walking argument against divine logic. Charles couldn't chew food properly, couldn't produce heirs, could barely rule. His tongue was so large he drooled, his speech was nearly incoherent, and yet he was king. Because the bloodline came first. So now lying on stiff linen sheets, you try not to think about that. Or about your child. Or about the crypt where your grandmother rests her stone effigy holding a baby that never lived. You try to focus on the here and now, on breathing. In, out, and then the worst begins. You scream into a pillow as something tears inside. Time bends. You see flashes of ceiling, of red hands, of worried faces. Hours, maybe days pass. You drift in and out. The child comes, or doesn't, or comes still. No one tells you at first. They're too busy trying to stop your bleeding. Later you wake up. You're cold. You feel hollow. If your baby lived, they'll be taken from you. Whisked away to be raised by governesses, judged not for their giggles or smiles, but for their usefulness. If they died, there will be a christening anyway. A tiny crown, a velvet pillow, a name carved into stone before they ever said mama. Either way, you're broken now. You're praised in court for your duty, but your body knows the truth. Something in you is fading. Your hair dulls. Your joints ache. The sparkle behind your eyes flickers out like the last flame of a guttering candle. And yet they'll expect you to do it again and again until you produce an heir or die trying. Quirky tidbit. Some noble women were buried with wax effigies of the babies they miscarried. These lifelike dolls were dressed in royal swaddling and given tiny coffins just so no one could say the family line had failed too badly. And that's your legacy. You're a mother. Or not. A womb. A ghost. A bloodline wrapped in silk and sorrow. You shuffle through your days like a half-remembered hymn waiting for the next round, the next blessing. Because in your world, motherhood isn't sacred. It's strategic and deadly. You don't get to choose. That's the first thing you learn. Love stories are for peasants and poets. You're a royal daughter, which means your marriage will be signed, sealed, and delivered long before you even know what you like in a person, let alone whether you'd want to kiss them without gagging. It doesn't matter if your betrothed is kind. It doesn't matter if he's 17 or 70. And it definitely doesn't matter if he's your first cousin. In fact, that's sort of the point. You're sitting in a rose-draped garden, maybe feeding a parrot, bits of candied almond, when the news comes. You're to marry your cousin Leopold, or your uncle Philip, or your half-brother Ferdinand. They all blend together eventually. He's royal, he's Catholic, and he's got just enough shared blood to make your family archivist weep with joy. The idea is simple. Keep the crown in the family. Keep the land, the language, and the gold untouched by outsiders. What it actually does, well, let's just say your future children won't be getting any genetic diversity for Christmas. Mainstream historians all agree dynastic marriages were political chess moves, not romantic tales. Think Marie Antoinette shipped off from Austria to France at 14. She cried for days after crossing the border and being forced to leave behind every Austrian belonging she had, even her dog. But it didn't matter. She was now a pawn. A diplomatic peace treaty in a powdered wig. You too are expected to smile, wave, and look fertile. What's that? You actually like someone else, maybe the stable boy with the kind eyes who helped you down from your horse last spring. Too bad. He has no lineage, no dowry, no purpose in your family tree. In fact, he's so far outside your family tree, it's dangerous. The kind of scandal that ruins treaties, not just reputations. And so instead, you marry your cousin. At the altar, he smells like vinegar and privilege. His lips are chapped. He keeps blinking too fast. You stand there in a satin gown stitched with gold thread, and you can't help but wonder how many diseases are we about to mix together in our children. Spoiler alert. Take Queen Victoria's daughters, for example. She had 9 children, and thanks to cousin matching and genetic roulette, the family tree spread hemophilia like butter on toast. Princess Alice's son, Friedrich, died of a nosebleed. Yes, a nosebleed that wouldn't stop. And yet no one hit the brakes. The cousins kept marrying. The daughters kept being offered like silver coins at a market. There's even a particularly grim tradition in some royal houses where daughters were promised to cousins in infancy, literal babies. Betrothal treaties signed while the girl's still in swaddling. So you're born into a crib and a contract. Fringe tidbit. One Bavarian princess was so devastated by her forced marriage to a dull cousin that she shaved her head in secret and tried to fake madness. It didn't work. They just labeled her moody and proceeded with the wedding anyway. You sometimes wonder what life would be like if you had been allowed to marry for love. A small cottage. A few children, maybe sturdy ones. Laughter in the kitchen. A husband who actually listens when you speak. No court etiquette. No ceremonial dinners where you're forbidden to eat more than 3 bites. Instead, you're here, trapped in a marriage that's mostly silence and ceremonial appearances. Your husband kisses your forehead like he's afraid of catching emotion. You lie next to him in a bed big enough for an entire hunting party and still feel like you're suffocating. Historians still argue whether these royal daughters were resigned to their fate or if they held secret rebellions we've never heard about. Diaries hidden in walls. Letters burned before dawn. Maybe a poem scrawled on the back of a prayer book, just to remember what wanting felt like. You try not to think about the stable boy, but late at night, when your cousin husband is snoring and the moonlight turns the stone floor silver, you close your eyes and imagine his laugh, his sunburnt hands, the way he helped you pick wild strawberries without asking for anything in return. It was foolish. It was fleeting. But it was yours. Still, you did your duty. You married the right man wrong in every way but lineage. You posed for portraits. You produced heirs, or tried, because your body may be yours, but your heart was never part of the contract. There's lace at your throat, laudanum in your tea, and arsenic soaking into your bathwater. Welcome to Vienna, where the palace walls are gilded and the expectations suffocate. You're an archduchess now, another daughter of the House of Habsburg, raised behind velvet curtains, trained to glide rather than walk, and praised for your porcelain skin, which is definitely not due to arsenic, even though you soak in it daily. Your aunts insist it brightens the complexion. Of course, no one mentions what it does to your liver or your teeth. You live in the long shadow of Empress Elizabeth of Austria Sisi, as they called her, a woman so obsessed with appearances that she wore a tight-laced corset down to 18 inches and fasted on meat juice and orange slices. Her legacy, romanticized in portraits and waltzes, is anything but soft when you're the niece trying to live up to it. Because to be born a Habsburg Archduchess is to inherit a legacy of decay disguised as glamour. You begin your days with ice-cold baths, followed by 2 hours of hairbrushing, 300 strokes, no fewer. Your governesses watch you sip bone broth from silver spoons, then recite courtly French and read the Latin Psalms aloud, all while being evaluated for posture clarity and whether your voice is marriageable. And that's just before lunch. Your mother warns you constantly, never smile too widely. Your teeth are your weakest link. That's what inbreeding does. Your jaw is delicate, almost receded, and if you bite too hard, you just might crack a molar. So you sit still. You sip broth. You survive in elegance. What no one talks about, at least not above a whisper, is how many of your cousins also grew up this way. Because the Habsburg daughters didn't just share gowns and governesses. They shared genes and ailments and expectations that pressed in from every direction, tighter than any corset. One cousin has seizures. Another refuses food. A third disappears into a convent by age 15, officially for religious calling, but everyone knows what that means. She's too frail to marry, too strange to display, and too devout to be politically useful. Historians still argue whether this wave of female fragility was truly medical or simply a case of generational trauma wrapped in silk. But when a single family refuses to marry outside itself for centuries, the results start to pile up in their bodies, in their minds. You take a walk through the Schönbrunn Gardens one morning, parasol angled just right, and pass your cousin Maria, who now refuses to speak. Her eyes dart like a deer's, and her hands tremble slightly beneath her gloves. You were best friends once. She used to sneak you candied violets. Now she barely remembers your name. Fringe fact: the Habsburgs had a physician who believed hysteria in royal girls could be treated with a daily glass of goat's milk mixed with brandy. By all accounts, it didn't work, but the girls did stop complaining. Probably because they were unconscious. You'd laugh if your ribs weren't already bruised from corset bones. You hear whispers that your uncle wants to marry you off to the Duke of Parma, a man who by some trick of royal genealogy is your double cousin. He once tried to kiss your hand and sneezed mid-bow. That's your future, unless you're lucky enough to fade away quietly first. Some girls do. Illness becomes a kind of salvation, a long, dignified decline. Pale cheeks, soft sighs. A final carriage ride to the countryside where no one expects you to be pretty or political ever again. You think of Sisi again. Her legacy lingers in the marble halls, in the paintings of her impossibly tiny waist, in the rumors of her melancholy. She lost children. She skipped state dinners. She wandered through Hungary in morning gowns, chasing shadows. Some say she was vain. Others say she was broken by the very system she helped sustain. You don't know which is more tragic, because while the history books remember the archduchesses in terms of who they married and what treaties they symbolized, you know them as girls who once braided each other's hair, who sang off-key, who played hide-and-seek between the tapestries. Before the arsenic, before the laudanum, before the bloodline's demands turned them into sacrifices in lace. You light a candle for your cousin one night, the quiet one who always embroidered stars on her sleeves. She died last week of fever, though you suspect it was something slower, something deeper, the kind of death that starts long before the body gives out. You stare into the flame and wonder how many more of you there will be. How many more royal daughters walking this same path, balancing grace and genetics until both give way. You wonder how many already haunt these halls. You wake to silence. Heavy velvet drapes mute the world, and for a moment, it's hard to tell if it's morning or just another gray slice of royal eternity. Your lady-in-waiting whispers that you're expected at breakfast. You nod, even though you haven't really felt hungry in days. The palace never sleeps, but you, like many daughters of royalty, barely feel awake. You're not alone in this fog. Everywhere you turn, royal daughters carry that same fragile look in their eyes. Not weakness exactly, just weariness. Minds that were never given room to rest. Bodies that were bred more for lineage than longevity. At court, the phrase delicate constitution gets thrown around like rose petals. But when a dozen young women in the same bloodline faint during a single opera performance, you have to wonder if maybe it's something more. Catherine of Austria, the one who always seems to have a book under her arm, hasn't spoken more than a few words all week. Her tutor says it's nerves. Her mother says it's spirits. A chambermaid says it's what happens when your family tree folds in on itself like badly baked strudel. Science doesn't have a name for it yet. But you know the pattern: headaches, tremors, unpredictable moods, and the sort of sadness that lingers in your chest like damp lace. You see it all over Europe. In the Prussian courts, a princess develops a twitch in her left eye and is sent to a rural estate for the heir. In France, a duchess sobs during a garden party, then insists she's being followed by invisible bees. In England, Queen Victoria's descendants quietly develop what polite society calls nervous conditions. Historians still argue whether this was all just hysteria, as 19th century physicians loved to diagnose, or whether it was something biological, something recessive, something that slipped from womb to womb like a whispered curse. One fringe theory, now mostly discarded, claimed that the noble houses were breeding themselves into psychological collapse, that the royal temperament wasn't about divine right, but about diluted gene pools and overstressed nervous systems. Charming. You wouldn't be surprised. You've seen the quiet unraveling too often to ignore it. And yet in public, you're expected to sparkle, to waltz and curtsy and recite poetry without a tremor in your voice. At state dinners, you sip wine with trembling hands and hope no one notices. Your cousin Louisa once fainted so hard into a bowl of custard that it made the papers. The headline read, "A whiff of lavender overwhelms a duchess." That was the official story. The real one, Louisa hadn't eaten in 3 days, terrified that gaining weight might make her less appealing for the next diplomatic match. Lavender had nothing to do with it. In private, you all talk in whispers, little confessions over embroidery or tea. One girl says she hears music in her head at night, even when the halls are quiet. Another talks about a pressure in her chest, like something is always about to snap. Sometimes someone vanishes for a while. A rest cure, they say, or a sudden retreat to a distant monastery. They always return quieter, calmer. But there's something glassy behind their eyes, like they've been pressed flat between the pages of history. And always there's the pressure to marry, to produce heirs, to maintain alliances. Your body is both temple and treaty. You remember when one of your cousins, Anna, sweet Anna, got engaged to a Saxon prince. She was 16 and already on her second nervous collapse. They married her off anyway. Within a year, she was dead of childbed fever. That's what the doctors wrote. But those who knew her said she never stopped shaking. You wonder what might have happened if any of you had been born common. If you'd been allowed to run barefoot, to eat cheese without judgment, to read novels without worrying they'd rot your mind. Maybe your thoughts wouldn't feel so foggy. Maybe you'd laugh more freely. Maybe you'd still feel real. Instead, here you are wandering through gilded halls that feel increasingly like a dollhouse. Everything ornate, everything fragile, including you. A physician visits once a week. He checks your pulse, your pupils, your tongue. He prescribes walks in the garden, fewer novels, more fish. You nod, say thank you, and go right back to hiding books in your bodice. Because the only thing more dangerous than being a royal daughter with a fragile mind is being one who knows it. You've learned to fake it. The composure, the brightness, the way you pinch your cheeks before a formal dinner to mimic a healthy flush. And still behind your eyes, the questions swirl, is this just you? Or is it your grandmother's madness echoing forward? Your uncle's melancholy sliding sideways through the family tree. You pass a portrait gallery one afternoon, dozens of noble women, painted in impossible serenity. You know the stories behind the frames. The ones who died in childbirth. The ones who whispered to themselves in empty halls. The ones who were too delicate to rule. You recognize the look in their eyes. You've seen it in your mirror. And somewhere deep down you realize this isn't weakness. This isn't drama. This is the cost. The quiet tax that royal daughters have paid for generations. Fragile in mind. Brittle in body. Strong enough to stand up at court, but just barely. You press a hand to your chest. Still breathing. Still here. But sometimes it feels like that's all you are. You sit beneath a stained glass window, the morning light turning your hands into mosaics. The palace is quieter now. Not peaceful, never that, but quieter, like someone's turned the volume down on a fading empire. And as you glance through the corridor lined with cracked portraits and dusty banners, one thing is clear. The Habsburgs, your family, your name, your burden, are falling apart. Not in a dramatic sword-clashing way. It's slower, sadder. More like watching a grand cake collapse in slow motion. You still wear the silk. You still sign letters with elaborate curls. But even the servants have started whispering that the world is changing. That the grand experiment of keeping power in the family may finally be ending. You're not sure whether to cry or exhale in relief. The signs are everywhere. In Vienna, ministers murmur about revolution. In Spain, your cousins send more priests than soldiers. And inside your own house, the legacy of inbreeding, those soft eyes, those misshapen jaws, those delicate minds, has become impossible to ignore. Your brother, the heir, is 18 and can't walk without assistance. Your niece refuses to speak ever. Your aunt collects dead birds and lines them up on her windowsill. You used to think she was eccentric. Now you're not so sure. Historians still argue whether this decline was inevitable or just badly timed. Was it really the genetics, they ask, or was it war religion, bad money management? But to you, sitting here in this aging palace, it all feels connected. The fragility of your bodies, the rigidity of your customs, the way your ancestors drew their family tree like a spiral instead of a line. It's all catching up now. You think of Charles II of Spain, your cousin, your cautionary tale. The last of his line. A man born so twisted by generations of incest that he couldn't chew his food or speak clearly. They called him El Hechizado, the Bewitched. But there was no magic in what made him. Just math. He died childless, of course. His autopsy read like a horror novel, a heart the size of a walnut. Black lungs, intestines in the wrong places. A lifetime of breeding for bloodline perfection ended in biological collapse. You'd write him a letter if you could. Tell him you get it. You're still here, yes. Still technically royal. But the cracks are showing. In the walls, in your health, in everything. You're watching the end of a dynasty from the inside out. The empire that once ruled continents now can't rule its own limbs. The old alliances don't hold. The bloodlines are thinning not by design, but because no one's left to marry. The cousins are all either dead, unwell, or worse, French. You giggle at the thought, which turns into a snort, which turns into a cough. You wipe your mouth on a monogrammed handkerchief. It comes away pink. You stare at it for a moment too long. This is how decline happens. Not with a guillotine, but with a whisper, with a cough. with a princess who can't climb the stairs without getting dizzy, and yet the portraits keep going up. They still paint you. You sit for hours trying to keep your chin lifted, even as your bones ache from scoliosis. You wear sapphire rings on fingers that swell in the cold. You smile, or at least try to. But even the painters are growing tired of pretending. There's a new realism in their brushstrokes, less glow, more shadows. You glance around your drawing room. The tapestries are fading. The gold filigree is flaking. Even the royal dogs look depressed. No one says it aloud, but the staff walks lighter now, like they're afraid of knocking the whole place down. It doesn't help that the newspapers are getting bold. One cartoon in a French pamphlet showed a Habsburg princess with crossed eyes and 6 toes cradling a globe made of glass. It was cruel, but not inaccurate. The world is watching your family's collapse like a slow-burning scandal. Everyone loves a train wreck, especially when the train was once covered in diamonds. You've heard whispers of the new royal families rising less obsessed with purity, more concerned with charisma. The British are learning PR. The Germans are breeding soldiers. The Russians are, well, still Russian, but even they've noticed that marrying your niece is no longer fashionable. You wish your ancestors could see this. Or maybe you don't. They'd probably just double down and marry a cousin out of spite. Still, not all is lost. You look to the younger girls in your court, some with brighter eyes, stronger postures. Daughters of diplomats and generals and shockingly commoners. The scandal is still fresh, but it's happening. Slowly, the idea of marrying outside the blood is catching on. Because what good is a pure lineage if it ends in madness, infertility, and a collection of embroidered death shrouds? One of your cousins recently wed a merchant's son. The family pretended to be horrified, but you saw how healthy her baby looked. Round cheeks, alert eyes, fingers that grasped. That alone felt revolutionary. The old order is cracking, and maybe, just maybe, that's the best thing that could happen. You trace a finger down the marble banister as you descend the stairs. You wonder who will live in this palace 100 years from now. Whether they'll know what you endured. Whether they'll understand the price paid for dynastic pride. Or whether they'll just see the portraits, tilt their heads and say, "Weren't they beautiful?" You smile, this time for real. You might not be able to change the past, but you feel something stirring, a kind of release, a quiet knowledge that your bloodline's collapse might just be the first breath of its rebirth. And that, dear listener, is more comforting than any crown. You wake to birdsong, real, persistent, unroyal birdsong. Not the cooing of doves bred for courtly gardens, but loud, chaotic squawks from sparrows nesting in the crumbling masonry outside your window. You stretch your back aching, and for a fleeting second, wonder what it might be like to wake up somewhere else. Somewhere normal. Somewhere with chickens instead of footmen, with bread ovens instead of ballrooms. But no, you're still here, still a royal daughter. And today you're expected to attend another marriage negotiation. This one feels different, though. The suitor is foreign. No noble title. Wealthy, yes, but from trade, not blood. His great-grandfather apparently sold whale oil. Scandalous. He might as well have been a pirate. Your aunt is horrified naturally. She called it a genetic downgrade. Your cousin scoffed and muttered something about peasant ankles. But behind their powdered contempt, you sense the truth. They're terrified. Terrified because the walls are closing in, and there aren't many Habsburgs left to marry. There's an unspoken panic now, a desperation swirling beneath the silk. The old strategies are failing. You can't marry within the family anymore because you've already done it for 20 generations. And frankly, the results are horrifying. Historians still argue whether the Habsburg marriage policy was brilliant diplomacy or reckless roulette. One side calls it a masterclass in alliance building. The other says it was just really posh inbreeding. But nobody disputes the outcome: jaws so twisted they couldn't close minds, so fragile they snapped under court pressure, fertility so low you needed an heir and 3 backups just to hedge your bets. You sip from a porcelain teacup, your hands trembling slightly, and stare at the letter confirming your upcoming betrothal meeting. This man, this outsider, is everything your ancestors warned you about. And yet, something inside you dares to feel hopeful. He might not have a coat of arms, but maybe, just maybe, he has working chromosomes. You pause, startled by your own humor. Your governess would be appalled. Outside, you hear footsteps echo through the corridor. Your younger sister peeks in her face, pale beneath powder. She's only 15 and already shows signs: the long nose, the lazy eye, the awkward gait that reminds everyone of cousin Friedrich, who once walked into a harp and blamed it on spirits. You reach out and pull her close. Don't worry, you whisper, things are changing, and they are. Quietly, stubbornly, inevitably. The old nobility is being forced to loosen its grip. Money is replacing blood as the currency of marriage. And some of the younger royals, your generation, are starting to see the appeal in leaving the ancestral gene pool behind. Of course, there's still resistance. In one recent ball, a duke refused to dance with a viscount's daughter because she had merchant ears. What does that even mean? Were they shaped like gold ingots? You nearly choked on your canapés laughing. But underneath the satire, there's tension. The monarchy is beginning to fracture, not because of swords or revolts, but because the royal family can't produce itself anymore. Not without fresh genes. Not without stepping outside the velvet cage they've spent centuries building. And for some of them, stepping out feels like betrayal. One cousin told you he'd rather die celibate than dilute the blood. You didn't say it, but the blood is already diluted, just not with strangers, with cousins, over and over, until it's no longer noble, just tired. Still, some cling to the past. They commission portraits, invent new coats of arms, and recite endless genealogies as if repeating them will summon health and fertility like a magic spell. Spoiler alert, it won't. Not even Latin helps at this point. Your fiancé arrives tomorrow. You've never met him. You only know he's tall, has teeth, and can ride a horse without vomiting. That already puts him in the top 5% of potential grooms. The court is divided. Half whisper that it's the end of royal dignity. The other half are just relieved you're not marrying your own uncle. You walk through the gardens that afternoon, trailing your fingers over the wilting roses. A gardener nods politely. You nod back. He looks healthier than most dukes you know. It hits you then, the absurdity of it all. The way you've been taught to fear mixing with lesser blood, even as that same pure blood gives you migraines, joint pain, and endless miscarriages. You recall something a tutor once said: royalty is like fine porcelain, beautiful, but not meant for daily use. He meant it as a compliment. You now see it as a warning, because porcelain cracks. You step into the hallway again, past portraits of your ancestors. The ones with 5 names and 1 chin. You pause at one in particular, Empress Maria Anna, who married her own uncle. The painter tried to flatter her, but even the oils couldn't hide her fatigue. Was it worth it, you whisper? She doesn't answer. Her eyes are glass. Yours are still warm. Maybe you'll be the last of your kind. Maybe not. But something is ending here. Not with an explosion, but with a quiet, creaking pivot toward survival, toward sanity, toward the radical idea that love, or at least compatibility, might matter more than a family crest. Tomorrow, you'll meet the man who might save your line from itself, not by continuing the spiral, but by finally stepping out of it. You exhale. The birds are still squawking. Somewhere a bell rings for supper. You feel something unfamiliar in your chest. Hope! You stand in front of a wall of oil-painted women. Their names echo in history books, but their eyes, if you look long enough, reveal more than triumph or beauty. They're tired, heavy. Some stare through you, some away from you. You've walked this gallery 100 times, but tonight it feels different. Like you've finally been invited behind the velvet rope. This is your inheritance. The gallery starts with the towering portraits, the empresses and archduchesses of centuries past. Thick gold frames elaborate neck ruffs, rosaries, and rubies. From a distance, they seem divine. But lean in closer, and the flaws come alive, elongated jaws, distant gazes, peculiar posture, unsettling symmetry. You catch sight of Maria Theresa's seventh daughter, Maria Carolina, Queen of Naples, and Sicily, standing with stiff hands, chin tilted just high enough to seem proud. But the artist had to disguise her curvature of the spine with clever drapery. Her joints had begun swelling by 17, and she walked with a brace most of her life. Next to her is Marie-Louise, daughter of Francis II. She married Napoleon. You remember being taught that it was a brilliant match, a Habsburg peace offering to an emperor born from revolution. But no one mentioned the tumors on her back or the seizures that began in her 20s. Nervous disorders, the doctors said. The gallery bends into a narrower hall, darker, quieter. Here the frames are simpler. The women less royal, but more tragic. You pause at Princess Amalie of Saxony. You were told she was a gifted composer, but never that she wrote most of her music alone in a room while recovering from a series of mysterious fainting spells no one could explain. Historians still argue whether these were genetic epileptic episodes, stress-induced female hysteria, or simply the result of a too shallow gene pool meeting too high expectations. You continue, and then comes the last room, smaller, emptier, the portraits fewer and more modern. Here the eyes look more familiar, a flicker of self-awareness. Less pomp, more pain. You stop at Archduchess Elizabeth Marie, the great-granddaughter of Emperor Franz Joseph. Her frame is modest, her dress simple. She renounced her title and became a socialist in her later years, rejected court life altogether. Some called her disgraceful, others called her free. You're not sure which yet. But the choice, the sheer presence of it, feels revolutionary. For centuries, these royal daughters had no such choice. Their purpose was clear: marry, reproduce, die, preferably without scandal. Whether sick or sane, fertile or barren, beloved or neglected, they were cogs in dynastic machines. And yet, some resisted. Some wrote poetry. Some eloped. Some went mad, not because of inbreeding perhaps, but because they were imprisoned in a loop they could never escape. You're nearing the end of the hall now. The final portrait hangs slightly askew, as if history itself is uncertain what to do with it. No nameplate. No backstory. It's a young woman in a blue sash. Her face is unremarkable. Not grotesque. Not beautiful, just tired. You look into her eyes. She looks back. You realize this one wasn't meant for public display. Maybe someone hid it here hoping she'd be forgotten, or hoping someone like you would one day understand. You step back. This isn't just a gallery. It's a graveyard of expectations encased in gold leaf and family pride. And somewhere in the shadows, between brushstrokes, you see the true cost of royal inbreeding. Not just in the genes, but in the silence, the exhaustion, the slow generational erosion of agency. The good news, that cycle is breaking. Modern royals, for all their designer clothes and Instagram accounts, now marry for love most of the time. Genetic diversity has quietly crept back in, hidden behind smiles and palace PR. And science, thankfully, has replaced superstition. But you'll never unsee this gallery. You walk out slowly, the hush of the room clinging to your shoulders like lace. And you wonder if all of these daughters could speak now. What would they say? Would they whisper warnings? Would they beg for freedom? Or maybe, just maybe, they'd thank you for listening. Word count 1053. Wind down approx. 300 words. Now the palace lights dim. The portraits blur as you drift away from the gallery, leaving behind the faint scent of varnish and rosewater. Your footsteps quiet against cool stone. The whispers of royal daughters fade into the silence, and even the walls, once heavy with secrets, seem to exhale. You step outside. The air is cool still. A soft breeze nudges the garden hedges, and the sky above is endless and kind. For centuries, the weight of crowns crushed more than shoulders. It stole choice. It distorted beauty. It turned love into politics and birth into a gamble. But tonight, you're no longer part of that pattern. You've walked through it, seen its faces, heard its unspoken cries. And now you're free to leave it behind. The stars stretch above you, uncaring of bloodlines. A faint rustle of leaves becomes your lullaby. No jewels, no judgments, just the night. Breathe in, let it go. You are not a porcelain figure. You are not a name on a scroll. You are not someone else's marriage treaty. You are simply here, safe and still. Let your thoughts soften. Let your eyes close. The gallery is behind you now. Only dreams ahead. Sleep well, traveler. End of script. Sweet dreams.